Do School Better, a podcast for people who want to transform education. My name is Doris Corda. In this season, I discuss the core principles of my educational philosophy with Tim Desmond and Allison Tanker, my co-teachers from Hawken School's Entrepreneurial Studies program. It's not about what you teach, it's about what they learn.
In this episode, Doris recalls the process of designing and building Hawken's Entrepreneurial Studies program in a high school and why using real business problems should be core to entrepreneurship programs. Doris and Tim also discuss the role of the Lean LaunchPad methodology and design thinking and why it's so important to get out of the building. When you were planning this program, I know there were two schools of thought that you were intentional in sort of incorporating into building this, and those were Lean LaunchPad and design thinking. So I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about the elements of each of those and how they have, how we use those in the course, how we've adapted them, how we've changed them, altered them, any of that sort of thing.
Actually, I'll actually say it a little differently than you just said it. So when I first started planning this, I wanted to build an entrepreneurship class where students learn skills and knowledge by working on real problems on teams. That's really what I wanted. Mm-hmm. And I did some research my first year, and I looked around, and I learned some stuff about design thinking, and they have a great, as you know, they've even, and since then it's developed quite well. They've got some educators' toolkit stuff, which is really nice. But I actually hadn't heard yet about Lean LaunchPad. That didn't come till later. There was a teacher that I hired at one point who had done a startup weekend, and she came across Lean LaunchPad during that and said, hey, we should look at this. We went to a workshop. I met Steve Blank at a workshop. I had not been aware of it until then. And as you know, I did a startup weekend with you, actually. Yes. And we learned, so when I learned about, well, let me say this also. When I scoured the scene, this was before there was anything.
This is what year, approximately?
Well, I've been here 4.5 years, so this was 2011, 2012. So I was literally, for that year, I was doing two things. I was planning the major elements of the course, and I was looking around at what there was. And I also learned by doing, and when I design a new course, I know that most of the design work happens when you're actually teaching it. So there's not, there's only so much you can, there's only so much you can set up ahead of time. So, I researched that year where there were entrepreneurship programs, and what I found was very little, actually, that I considered entrepreneurship, hardly anything. I found, this was 4.5 years ago, I found at the graduate school level, I did find some programs that were called entrepreneurship programs. When I looked into what they were almost entirely spray-painted MBA programs. They were still how to write a business plan, read this case study, let's talk about what, maybe there were some small business approach things. I found very little that fit what I was, you've heard me say it, how to turn ideas into successful realities, all this stuff that I learned about entrepreneurship. In the software days, I didn't find much. The undergraduate level, I really didn't find anything. And at the K-12 level, wow, did I not find anything. So I either found, what Steve Blank refers to as how to build a lemonade stand, where there was some project somebody was doing to start, my mom has a great chocolate chip cookie recipe, and I'm going to sell them at the corner.
Or selling pencils on the school store model, right? That kind of thing.
That's right, selling pencils. Although I have to say, back then, even there wasn't even a lot of that. I mean, now it feels like, oh, everybody has an entrepreneurship program, and there are pitch competitions all over the place. That's really been very recent that stuff's developed. So I didn't see a whole lot. And the reality is, other people had started to hear about Lean LaunchPad. I had not yet. It was very early for Steve Blank and those guys as well. So we dove in, and what I was very, very focused on was how, with finding the real business problems and structuring those, and how we would set up the problem solving so that the learning would happen, and the learning along the way, and what were the kinds of assignments and materials and research they could find along the way, etc. So that's where my head was, and having taught for many years, I was really thinking about what should those problems look like, and then how do we guide the learning along the way, etc. So when she said, "Hey, you really need to look into this Lean LaunchPad," and then we did a startup weekend, and we went to Steve's educators workshop, I was very excited, and we used Lean LaunchPad really from the beginning as the foundational methodology for developing the business model. And so it's really, I'm not the only person to, I remember when I realized this in the first educators workshop, Steve's educators workshop, it's the scientific method for today. That's really what it is. You make hypotheses, it structures hypothesis making, and then you have to either validate or reject your hypothesis based on research that you do. Then you come up with you've seen it, right?
Yeah, I think it might be worth stepping back for a second and just talking for a few minutes about Startup Weekend, in case people don't know or not familiar with that, and how and what that is. It's basically a pitch competition that's over a weekend, and they hold these in every city, all cities across the world, and you basically have 54 hours to put an idea into reality. And so you get together on a Friday night with people who you may not know, you probably don't know. You listen to pitches, you self-select teams. On Sunday night, you then present a 6, 7, 8 minute presentation to judges based on this business model that you've created. And that in itself is not particularly important, but what's important is the process you described in Lean LaunchPad, this idea of spending that weekend, if you're doing it right, going out and validating your idea, talking to people, interviewing people, and then incorporating those ideas into the pitch you're going to give on Sunday night. And I think it's important to just briefly touch on that, because it's sort of how I came to Lean LaunchPad. And if you know nothing about Lean LaunchPad or this model, a startup weekend is a good way to kind of get your feet wet and commit one weekend and you do it instead of reading about it. So I thought that was probably good just to kind of lay that groundwork so people understand what we're talking about with Startup Weekend.
Yeah, and there's a lot to it, right? The whole lean startup approach, right? With what we've learned about how to turn ideas into successful realities that can scale and have broad appeal and impact, and how to do that, and everything from, you don't create a good plan for a startup by going into a room and spending 6 months building a business plan and coming out the other end and saying, okay, now I'm ready, to how do you actually develop a product that solves a problem or fills a need? How do you do that well? There are processes in lean startup that have been developed. It's interesting, over the course of many, many, many different people using these in many different contexts for many different reasons.
So let's talk about one that's pretty core to what we do, this idea of an MVP. So can you maybe talk about what an MVP is and how we use it in the context of our program?
And I should say that, we really don't go full throttle with lean startup until the very final part of the class. So in the first more than 2/3, maybe 3/4 of the class, We use some of these methods. We use design thinking tools. We use a whole bunch of different things, but it isn't really until the very end of the course where this MVP comes in, for example.
Right. Yeah. It's worth saying this is not a Lean LaunchPad course.
Right.
We use elements of it.
We use elements of it. We use Lean Startup as the scientific, Lean LaunchPad as the scientific method. We use elements of it, absolutely. The minimally viable product is really important because, as happens with engineers and adults in the real world, the natural inclination of our students when they come up with a problem they want to solve is to go into a room and engineer the solution and stay in that room engineering the solution until they're ready and they can come out and say, here it is. And so this minimally viable product that you are really looking to build, the very smallest thing you can build that actually solves the problem, how you do that, how you test that, how you use that is a really, actually, it sounds simple, but it's elegant and it's a very sophisticated process that I should say it's a process that results in the students learning a very sophisticated approach to developing anything. It's really an interesting thing. They learn that we don't call it this, but in the course of using these lean startup methodologies, they develop very sophisticated understandings of patterns and systems and process development and project management that, regardless of what they do in the future, are going to come in very handy.
Yes, and some of those approaches apply to even the business problems that we tackle in the first part of the course.
They totally do, which is why we have them watch the Udacity Steve Blank videos. That's the very first thing they do coming into the class. Yeah.
One of the mantras, if we can call it that, is get out of the building.
Yeah, Steve's mantra, right?
Yeah, so I mean, we know what that means physically, but we've helped train educators who are not fortunate enough to have have those resources right outside the physical front door. So what does it get out of the building mean for the approach in general? What's behind that idea?
It's about understanding that you can't know. Mm-hmm. That you can't know. No matter how smart you think you are, you don't know. And the only way you learn is from others. So I certainly experienced it in the first 15 years of my career in the software business, which was filled mostly, this was the cowboy days, and it was mostly engineers who were mostly in love with their technology, and a sales or marketing presentation was usually a feature fest. Yeah. Like, it does this and it does this and it does that. And the fact that nobody actually else other than the person talking about it wanted it or thought it was that cool or needed it. There were so many crash and burn stories, right? I saw it. I learned this. I was never the smartest person in the room, but I listened. I listened, and I knew that I didn't know, and I needed to ask people, well, what do you need, and does this work, and how do you use it? And that's really, it's interesting when you use some of these things with teenagers. You have teenagers who really haven't had yet to work very hard at interacting with others and communications with others and listening hasn't really been a key ingredient for their success yet. So many of them haven't developed that yet. And you know this, we have so many students who the thing they resist most is first getting out of the building at all. And second, when they do get out of the building, they don't know, it's not obvious to them how to do a communication with another human being well, and toward a purpose. So there's a lot of learning in that. We talk about Lean Startup and we talk about Lean LaunchPad, and those are really useful. But really what happens is if you take a step up from all this, we're talking about problem solving. And in any problem solving exercise where the problems are difficult and real and unknowable yet, you have to use whatever resources and whatever techniques make sense at the time. By equipping the students early on with lean startup methods, with design thinking, the toolkit, how to build a persona, or how to interview for empathy, these different things. Those are tools I would call lean startup foundational methodology. It's more than just tools, a lot more than tools. It's an approach, it's a philosophy, it's a methodology, it's a whole line. By equipping students with all this, they're increasingly armed with things they can use to solve these problems.
Right. And the interview process, it's not even necessarily a lean LaunchPad approach. It's just basic design, good design principles, this idea that you want to elicit stories from people that will tell you what they do, not necessarily what they say. And students' inclination is to ask yes and no questions that validate what they already know they want to validate.
That's right. That's right. And one of the things that's interesting about Lean Launchpad and Lean Startup and the whole methodology, and the reason for the word lean, at least in my mind, is this whole notion that you try stuff. You try little things out and you learn from that, and then you iterate and try again, change some stuff, try again, then you try again. I mean, what industry, context, job, part of your adult life is that not a crazy valuable way to approach things, right? So even if, and this is why, when we do a workshop or we have somebody come and visit who wants us to help them build a course, even if it's not an entrepreneurship course, there are elements of this that are hugely valuable. And it doesn't have to be, a business model canvas with these 9 blocks. You'll see online that people have modified, the business model canvas to the point where the only way you recognize that it's still a business model canvas is it has the 9 blocks, et cetera, or whatever. But they're using...
Sometimes the 9 blocks. Sometimes like the 9 blocks.
Right. But, whether it's, whatever it is, you can use elements of it. And that's really what we did. We said, wow, we're teaching an entrepreneurship class. Here is an approach, a methodology that is fully developed for customer development, agile development, scientific method for building, iteratively building a solution. Wow, is that cool? Let's use it. Teach it to the kids early on. They get it. They start experiencing it over the course of the course. They increasingly use more and more of it. But along the way, they don't look at that as, oh, I must solve problems using this approach. They use all kinds of things. It's giving them a skill set and language and tools to experiment, try, fail. There's try again. They're useful in anything.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Do School Better. We would love to hear from you, so please leave us a comment or a review. And if you're interested in learning more, check out wildfire-education.org.